I'd now like to invite our next session's panelists to join me on the stage, as well as our moderator for this morning panel discussion, John Rash. John is an editorial writer and a member of the Star Tribune's editorial board, where he uses his media and advertising background to explore the intersection of media, culture, society, and politics. Please join me in welcoming John Rash and panelists. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thanks for the warm welcome, and thank you all for being here. I certainly am not going to be the first. I'm certain not to be the last, but it's remarkable and really encouraging to see such a full room, and especially with so many young people. And as most of you already know, so many of the nations that the Minnesota International Center interacts with and that are the subject of some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that will be talked about today have a remarkably disproportionate young population. And so seeing so many young people here on issues that affect young people so much, I think is a really terrific thing as well. And regarding the Minnesota International Center, as many of you may know, it is the one outside organization that we actually have had a specific partnership with on the editorial board, reflective of the great work that they do in the community and, by extension, of course, globally as well. Well, I'm going to introduce the panelists as they come up individually to speak. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Robin Phillips, who is the Executive Director at the Advocates for Human Rights. She has written about human rights, including trafficking in women, employment discrimination, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. She has also led delegations to Ghana and Liberia as part of the Advocates' work for Liberia's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As she comes up and as questions come to you and as the other panelists come, I know you're very, very inquisitive, so comment cards, question cards will be passed out. Please fill those out, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. But Robin Phillips, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to follow the presentations from the morning because it really helps us focus on what our values are here in Minnesota and what we've done really to move this issue forward and to take leadership really in the world in recognizing what does it mean to take a victim-centered approach, what does it mean to respect the human rights of the individuals who are caught up in these sex trafficking rings. And Minnesota's first response, and I'm going to have to, my PowerPoints, I'll flip through some of it because some of the territory's already been covered. But Minnesota first started looking at human trafficking, created a human trafficking task force, and I think Rachel Pelos looked at, or mentioned a little bit about that, which was an interdisciplinary committee of people, and they made a decision to first look at human sex trafficking. And so some of what we'll talk about today, or what we'll focus on in our panel is Minnesota's response to human sex trafficking. So this is just a review, again, for teaching. Oh, I'm sorry, someone's saying you can't see. Can you turn down the lights just a little bit? Anyway, well, the white's a little bit easier to read. This is just a review. I guess that's what you learn, and we have many students. You have to repeat many things, or repeat things a few times as part of teaching. But human trafficking is when one person obtains or holds another person in compelled service. So we've been talking about this morning the fact that it ranges from labor trafficking to sex trafficking, and that trafficking, separate from human trafficking, involves a lot of other things. But when we look at human trafficking, it involves sex trafficking, labor trafficking, but there's also some crossover that when people are living in vulnerability, that often, particularly women and girls, are also potentially vulnerable to sex trafficking. What we know about sex trafficking, again, that 98% really involves women and girls, that men and boys have also been sex trafficked, and that's horrifying, but that it's necessary to look at the gender aspects of trafficking, sex trafficking, in order to come up with appropriate interventions and then look to where to go beyond there. We talked a little bit about how difficult it is to know exactly how many. What we do know is that using the ILO definition, or the ILO estimate, but we know Minnesota has been a center for trafficking for both a supply, trafficking happens here, women, girls are trafficked in, trafficked out, and it's a serious problem that our state policymakers take seriously. I'm happy to have Dave Pinto here with us to talk about that and what our elected officials are doing. It's not new to Minnesota. We know it's been going on. It's not confined to the Twin Cities. We see trafficking patterns, suburbs to the cities, cities out to other states, reservations to the city, all over, even people being brought out into the harbor in Lake Superior. But I want to talk a little bit about when we look at what does it mean? How do we protect the human rights of victims? How do we respect the dignity of the individual, make sure they have what they need? And I think we have to look at what we have this international framework of the Palermo Protocol. We've got the federal law, as people have been talking about this morning, force, fraud, and coercion. And when we look at that, how does that really work on the ground? How does that work? I did some field work on sex trafficking in Moldova and Ukraine and saw this. We see it in Minnesota, that when you look at what's really happening, you need to look at when someone is sex trafficked, what's going on. And we saw here and in other places that people often try to separate out ordinary prostitution from sex trafficking for prostitution. And that when police are trying to enforce, when policymakers are trying to look at policy, that's a very artificial distinction. They're all forms of sexual exploitation. Some are dealt with in the law, not all. You look at where prostitution, sex trafficking, we use the term sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation. When I talk a little bit later, I'll mention some of the legal definitions, but people engaging in survival sex, sexual harassment, sexual abuse and assault that are outside of the commercial area but are also exploitative. And then prostitution, sex trafficking, stripping, pornography. We have seen direct correlations that the vulnerability in some of these other industries lead to sex trafficking, lead to forced prostitution. We also know that the average age of entry for juvenile prostitution is 12 to 14. So those prostituted as juveniles are brought into this commercial sex industry between the ages of 12 and 14. But let's look at who they are and what people experience when they're in the commercial sex industry. We know 85% are victims of childhood sexual abuse, rape, or incest. 70% suffer from emotional, physical, or mental disability. 75% have experienced homelessness. 83% are victims of assault with a deadly weapon. 95% are violently assaulted or coerced into sexual acts. 92% are victims of rape. 68% of women have PTSD. So we're talking about a vulnerable population largely, and looking at a wide range of needs when we start looking at what kind of services people who have been trafficked might need. There's also been a lot of discussion lately about prostitution and choice and whether or not legalization, partial legalization, and we don't want to sidetrack into that debate, but I'll touch a little bit on it to see where this fits into the bigger scheme. 92% of individuals in prostitution reported that they wanted to leave. This covered women in 5 different countries. When we look at a choice, is this really a choice? We have research now from women in the United States in areas where prostitution has been legalized and in the in a study in the counties in Nevada where prostitution is legal, 81% of the women reported they wanted to get out of prostitution, and not just that they someday wanted to leave, but they were desperate to get out of it at that time. So when we talk about choice, we need to be thinking about who are being trafficked, what's happening, and when we start thinking about what do we want to do about it. So we have this myth of choice, and I think Tom Hansen alluded to some of that, what creates this. We certainly see a lot in popular culture that supports a lot of the mythology, the woman with agency, the woman who has essentially a good life and is making a lot of money. That is not the reality. That's not what we see. I can't talk to someone who says they're able to do that, that I respect people being able to talk about that, but we see that in reality, this is a tiny portion. And when we talk about sexually exploited elite, for lack of a better term, but people who are in the exploitation of the commercial sex industry, but feel they have some form of agency. But what we do know also about that is that many who have spoken publicly, testified in different legislative arenas about their own personal agency, later talk about when they get out of the life, as they say, what they really were experiencing. And we need to, as we give voice to the victims, listen to people in all different stages. So we want to set this up, and I want to give time for my other panelists, but we talked about the Palermo Protocol. What's significant about that's been very helpful, it talks about commercial exploitation or sexual exploitation in a much broader sense than just prostitution, and it's helpful in looking at how we respond. That's been instructive. Also, for us in Minnesota, they use the UN definition of child, which is anyone under 18, which for some of you who were following the safe harbors, that was helpful here. It was complicated to look at. I think the U.S. is one of the few countries that parses out juveniles into different levels of ability to consent and have intent. The Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I think what's significant about that, when we talk about force, fraud, and coercion, the idea of that really only applies to people over 18. The federal law also acknowledges that it isn't necessary to make a showing of force, fraud, and coercion when we're dealing with people under 18. I'll skip this just to get to my other chart. Just talk about federal law and Minnesota law. As I just mentioned, the federal law requires a showing of force, fraud, and coercion if the victim is over 18. The law also applies to people trafficked for purposes of a commercial sex act, which is much broader than prostitution. Now, in Minnesota, when the legislature started looking at this, they looked at who are the victims, what's happening, when do they get in, how do they get in. Adults who have been prostituted are often prostituted as children as well. And is there something magical about turning 18 that changes their ability to make whatever we want to define as choice? And so Minnesota rejected that, and our law does not require a showing of force, fraud, and coercion, that people who are trafficked for the purposes of prostitution are victims, and that people who traffic those individuals are criminals. And it's really important to be able to do that. We see this, we saw some complicated trafficking ring busts where federal agents were involved with state agents, and the police in Minnesota are required to treat all trafficking victims as victims, and when they brought in federal agents, they are only looking at victims of people under 18. So if someone turned 18 the week before, they were in a different category, different eligibility for services. It was very complicated and not workable. Not workable when you look at the conditions that women are kept in, when you look at what's happening, when you look at the needs of the individual victims of this human rights violation. Making those kinds of distinctions just didn't make sense for us here in Minnesota. And again, I think to mention again, this is something that is newer. It's a newer idea, and Minnesota is taking the lead on that. So in Minnesota, pimping is sex trafficking. So we look at a commercial sex industry when one individual sells another individual for sex, that is trafficking. They've obtained a person, and again, going through the definition, that's sex trafficking for purposes of our laws here in Minnesota. And I think as we look at the other responses in Minnesota, which I'll turn over to Representative Pinto, to look at what we've done here when we've developed that framework to protect the human rights of victims of trafficking. And we'll take questions after.
Thank you very much, Robin. And I know that, at least for me, watching that presentation certainly sparked a lot of questions. I'm sure you have many, so keep those comment cards coming. And I know that the next two presentations will as well. And the next one, indeed, is from Dave Pinto, who represents the McAllister, Groveland, Highland Park, and Fort Road West 7th communities in the Minnesota House of Representatives. He is a prosecutor for the Ramsey County Attorney's Office, and in this capacity, he's led a team of attorneys prosecuting domestic violence involving children, and now focuses on juvenile sex trafficking. Representative Pinto, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, John. So just a caveat to begin, so because this has to do with policy, I'm here in my legislative capacity, but of course drawing on my work in the Ramsey County Attorney's Office. So I direct statewide training and protocol development under Minnesota's Safe Harbor system, so which relates so much to this. And I want to build on something that Robin just said about Minnesota law and sex trafficking, that the way that we present it to law enforcement, at least, is that under Minnesota law, trafficking is simply prostitution involving a third person. Whatever role the third person plays, they drive, they take photos, they're a traditional pimp, they're living off the proceeds, and they know this is prostitution. So it's a very broad definition, very different perhaps than you might have heard about earlier in the day, or even as you could see in federal law for adults at least, where force, fraud, or coercion has to be proven, although I can't think of a case that did not involve those elements of violence and of fraud in the course of the case. It's just very nice as a prosecutor not to have to prove that. So what's Minnesota's response to this? Really robust. And actually, as I'm getting ready to come up, I was thinking, I keep on thinking of more and more things that we could even be talking about related to it. So I'm just going to dive through and talk about just a few. The first step is, okay, so safe harbor, just a basic kind of working definition for now. This is simply our model for responding to this in our state. And I want to emphasize the collaborative nature of it. Many states, I think, around the country are doing all sorts of really good things on this issue, but one thing that I'm hearing we are doing uniquely well is how deeply collaborative. So it's both a public safety model, as a prosecutor working with cops, and that's important, but also a public health model, recognizing how complicated these situations are. It has to be multidisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional as well. This effort is really led in some ways by the Department of Health, by a prosecutor's office, by a sexual assault advocacy group, really robust in that way. The key point is that anybody under 18 cannot be arrested for or charged with prostitution. The Juvenile Delinquency Code actually has just like a carve-out. Like they took a scalpel and they just lifted it right out of the code. It's actually the only crime I can think of that's the case. If committed by a young person, it is not a crime. Just is not a crime anymore. Instead, they're directed to child protection and directed to services and treated as victims, as Robin pointed out. Now, that's complicated, the services that they need, right? And so there's a whole system that we're trying to set up to relate to that. The first step is just recognizing that we can use existing services, domestic violence shelters and support, youth and homeless youth shelters and support as well, but then trying to layer on other services and support as well. There's a hotline for services, 24 hours, that actually builds on an existing domestic violence hotline. There are grants for housing and supportive services. This is all through the State Department of Health, State Department of Human Services as well. And then there is a system of what's called navigators all throughout the state. This is actually the map today, but I think as of kind of maybe 2 weeks from now, the map will be changing. They're adding more navigators, more funding that came through this spring. And the idea is that if you are someone who comes across a kid in one of these regions and you are trying to figure out how can I connect her with services, how can I build my response, get a better response in my community, in our agencies, et cetera, There's someone who is available to you, this navigator who can connect you with that. 7 geographic regions currently, 7 navigators, but then there's also an 8th region, Northwest. Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake have a special Northwest tribal navigator, someone who's at White Earth, who's working with those 3 tribes, and actually I think very soon, the hope is that there'll be a navigator working with other tribes, and in the meantime, they're in those areas as well. So there's this infrastructure, and again, that's all through the Minnesota Department of Health. In the meantime, our office, the office that I work in outside of the legislature, Ramsey County, received funding to develop a statewide model protocol for responding to these. So this is just a very hard to read chart relating to it, but our colleagues at the Minnesota Coalition on Sexual Assault are partnering with us on this. We have a couple hundred system professionals in 15 different disciplines. I don't know if you can read that in the back there, but adolescent medicine, child advocacy centers, all the way through to victim youth services, prosecution, et cetera. We have people leading each of those groups and figuring out what's the best way to deal with these situations, how can we share in those areas. We've got survivor and youth input on the left, we've got cultural input from a number of different communities on the right, and the goal is that in the next couple months to have a set of guidelines and best practices for communities to use. I will tell you, this is really hard, and it will certainly be flawed when it comes out. Sorry. The way we often put this is we are building the plane while we're flying it, because the kids are out there, right? I mean, they're still coming. You still got to figure something out. And the infrastructure that we have in place in our state, and our state really has been a leader on gender violence issues for decades. I don't know if the Duluth model was mentioned at any point along the way here, but in the late 70s, early 80s, Duluth developed a model for responding to domestic violence that I think, Robin, is known worldwide, right? I mean, you say the Duluth model in, I don't know, Kazakhstan or wherever, like people know that. So Minnesota has been a leader. That's taken decades to build in our state, and we're still working on it. This we're trying to do in a relatively short period of time. So set of best practices for communities to share for that. We're also doing a lot of training. So our office was directed to train cops and prosecutors. Don't blame us for not training the other groups, because we were told to train those, so we're going to do that by the legislature. So we're developing a series of roll call videos, 3 15-minute videos that officers can see all around the state. And we've got a sort of a red card that is, that might come up. Oh, there it is, good. A red card that it's in a pocket that tells officers this is what to look for, questions to ask, evidence to collect, things to do, who to call, et cetera. We're getting that to every officer in the state. Next level up is that we're training, it's actually going to be a couple thousand officers at 25, more than 25 locations, and generally do 2 per location. So agencies can cycle officers through, getting as many as possible to get a more in-depth focus on this. I was just in St. Cloud yesterday and the day before doing these trainings, half-day trainings to get them there. And then the top step is to get investigators and prosecutors the deeper skills that they need. We got a conference coming up just in 2 weeks now. I'm trying not to panic. In the Brainerd area, more than 300 investigators and county attorneys. We did that last October, doing it this October. In addition, we're training, we kind of just did this on the side. We're training hotel workers. So this, I don't know how well you can see this, but it says, please do disturb, right? Please do disturb. So it goes back in kind of the back room of like maybe the laundry room or wherever else in a hotel or in the kitchen. For hotel staff to see, these are things to look for, calls to make, and kind of say, please keep an eye on this. And we've got an accompanying DVD. We've got this and the DVD translated into English, Spanish, Hmong, and Somali. So get it out to hotels, and we found that hotel staff is often identifying this. This is happening all over the place. These are available, by the way. We can talk. Okay, so then also criminal law changes part of Safe Harbor. So Robin referenced the broad definition of sex trafficking. So prostitution involving a third person really is what it boils down to. We could work through all the verbs and all, but that's what it is. We're getting a lot longer sentences. I'll show you more about that in just a second. It is now a felony to buy sex from somebody under 18. It used to be you had sex with a 16 or 17-year-old and you bought sex. That's just the same as buying sex from anybody. It's not, it's now a felony, and now those are definitely increasing. And there's a much longer statute of limitations just since this spring, recognizing that it's kind of a brainwash situation. It can take a while for victims to disengage. There used to be a 3-year statute of limitations. So boy, often by the time the victim is ready to participate, you're just about at 3 years. And I've had a number of cases, that's the case, and now suddenly she's done and she can't get relief anymore. this is making the statute of limitations match other crimes of sexual violence. Because this crime wasn't really viewed as a crime of sexual violence, right? I mean, originally it's a nuisance crime, prostitution, and we've kind of been shifting our focus on it. So these are two of the cases that I was co-prosecutor on, 36 years and 40-year sentences. In general, we're getting in the 20s and 30s, and as I say, even as many as 40-year sentences. Really taking these cases a lot more seriously, judges and others, all kinds of things around the state. And then finally, this is my last slide. As part of this, right, we have this recognition, okay, these people are victims. Well, if they're victims now, what about the women who are prostituting? How do we think about that? Just this spring, the legislature passed an affirmative defense for a prostitution charge. So a woman's charged with prostitution. If she can prove that she was prostituting as a result of being a victim of sex trafficking, she gets the charge dismissed. And the great thing is the standard is preponderance of the evidence, which for the lawyers in the room is like, it's just like you take a balance and then you stick one little grain of sand on the one scale and it tips and then boom, she's got it. So it's moving in that direction. Increasingly, law enforcement is shifting from doing Jane stings where they, because here's the thing, we show officers around the state this is happening. We show them Backpage.com. I don't know if you've heard about that, but just listing these ads. And we show them in St. Cloud or Bemidji or any place else. Wow, look at all the Backpage ads you have. And immediately they want to call and identify the women and go after. We've been really having them focus much more on placing the ads, going after the guys who are doing this rather than the women. And that's even meaning, so just, I have to say, at the St. Cloud training, in fact, one of the local presenters said, he's not from St. Cloud, I should emphasize, but from a local agency, said, we are not arresting adult women for this at all. If there's an arrest, we will, but we are not pursuing these prostitution cases. Instead, we're viewing them as them being victims, and we're going after the guys who are exploiting them. And even, therefore, my last point is there is a pending bill right now to essentially have safe harbor for adults, at least the carve-out, and say it will not be a crime to be selling sex, still deeply criminalizing the buying of sex, but recognizing the people who are selling sex are ultimately victims of exploitation. We'll be missing the broader sport and services and all, and there's a lot of talk about that, but you can feel an increasing momentum in our state in recognizing this change in philosophy. With that, I'll turn things over to John and to Brenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Pinto, and I'd now like to introduce Brenda Schultz, who is Director of Responsible Business with the Carlson Residor Hotel Group. She's responsible for all aspects of social, ethical, and environmental responsibility for a portfolio of 650 hotels in the Americas. Her duties include hotel training, communications, environmental measurements, and support for anti-human trafficking initiatives. Brenda Schultz, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for having me here today. I would like to be able to spend a little time with you, explain to you how businesses can be a part of the solution, where it may not seem like a natural thought to you right now, but hopefully you can see some of the things that we are doing and what other companies are doing so that you can get a better feel for this. I'm particularly excited because there's so many students in the room, and today the best and the brightest and the most passionate students coming out of our high schools and colleges are leaning towards going into nonprofit areas or maybe law enforcement. But we want you to still take business into consideration because businesses can do good. Carlson is working to do good in the area of combating human trafficking, also workforce development. And I work alongside other companies like Microsoft and Delta and Coca-Cola, Ford, ExxonMobil, big companies that really, really care about this issue and are taking a stand. So as some background about our business, Carlson is a global hospitality and travel company, and we're based here in Minnesota out of our Plymouth building. Being a travel and hospitality company, we realize that unfortunately human traffickers sometimes use our industry in the commission of their crimes. So we also realize that in many ways this actually puts us in a position, a unique position to do something about it. So instead of just, being upset that they're using this industry, we're like, wait a minute, now we have the opportunity to do something. So what can we do? We believe that all businesses have a broader capability and a social responsibility to promote and enhance human rights, right? We're part of our communities and we have a responsibility to those communities. So we believe that businesses can accomplish this by looking towards their core business activities, by looking at philanthropy, advocacy, and partnerships. So I'll give you some examples of this. We in our hotel business actually require all of our hotel employees to take human trafficking awareness training. It's a 30-minute module that all of them are required to take. In our contract clauses with suppliers, we have language in there stating our commitment to this, and that if they are found to do something that goes against this commitment, that we can actually stop using them as a supplier, so we can nullify our contract. We have a supplier code of conduct that goes beyond just the laws. We have in our code of business conduct and ethics for our employees that our company believes in this, and should they do anything that's counterproductive to our activities, that they could be terminated. We have a human rights policy, and our Carlson Wagenly Travel has a travel alert that goes out to travelers. So this travel alert that you see here on the screen is printed on travel itineraries for travelers who are leaving the United States and going to one of the 25 countries that has been identified by the State Department as high risk for child sexual exploitation, because we know that 25% of child sex tourists come from the United States. This is our most recent activity I'm very proud of. We partnered with ECPAT USA to create signs that go into our hotels. So now we're not just doing things behind the scenes, we're actually proclaiming our commitment to our guests. And even more importantly, we are raising awareness with our guests. We are providing contact information for anyone who might suspect a case of human trafficking. And we are providing contact information for victims to reach out for life-saving services. Our hope is that we will not be the only hotel company doing this, because this isn't something that is a competitive advantage for a company. This is something you share, so we hope that all of the industry will follow our lead in this. Philanthropy, this one seems pretty simple, right? Businesses make money, and we can donate to causes. We can donate to the advocates. We can help sponsor conferences, et cetera. So our Carlson Family Foundation does this in a strategic way to try to help move the needle on human trafficking. So not just let's drop some money here because someone asked for $5,000 or $10,000 here, but like, what can we really, really do? What kind of programs can we support that are really going to make a difference, not just for victims here in Minnesota, but that's something that then can be scaled up and out across the country. So other activities that you can look to as a business employee, you can say, well, I can't afford to give a whole bunch of money, but I have a hotel meeting space. So maybe we could have held this conference at one of our hotels. Sometimes we have to ask our guests, hey, we care about this issue. If you care about too, please donate, and we'll match every dollar that you donate. So you get the idea around raising funds for the cause, and then we can send those funds to people who really, really are in the trenches and can really help the victims of this crime. So advocacy and partnerships, I think that Dave talked about this a little bit. We cannot do this alone. Robin cannot do this alone. Dave cannot do this alone. And that is what Minnesota does better than any other state that I've seen. We collaborate, we work together. I knew Dave, I knew some other people in the room. We tend to, know each other because we work together, and we work on projects together. We support each other in different ways, and together we're really, really moving the needle, as you can see by some of the slides that Dave put up there. I mean, every time I see on my Facebook page that, Minnesota prosecuted a trafficker of a young girl and they got 40 years, you hear it in my household. So we can advocate for legislation. Businesses have a lot of influence, right? So politicians, they care about what businesses have to say because they bring money to their states, and they have lots of employees who vote. So we can get out there and we can advocate for legislation in this area, and sometimes our voice is heard where other voices aren't. So if we can lend our voice to those voices, we are happy to do that. We can work with law enforcement at our hotels. We can partner with educational institutions. We have a very close relationship with the University of Minnesota. And we can work together with NGOs, private sector, churches, etc. So it's not just us. I'm talking about all businesses. All businesses can do this type of thing if they just look to these different areas within their business. So I just wanted to share a couple of examples. Here I was on a trip with an entire delegation led by the Minnesota Women's Foundation. Minnesota Girls Are Not for Sale, and we went to Washington, D.C., and we met with different departments and congressmen and our state senators. Here we are at the Ramsey County Hotel Training launch. So this is when Dave's office put together hotel trainings for trainings in hotels other than ours. So we have Radissons and Country Inns, but you know, there's Holiday Inns and Hiltons and Marriotts and all these other hotels in their county that they want to make sure that they got training too. So we were very supportive. In fact, you can see it was held at a Radisson hotel. Plug for Radisson. And then in May, I was at the Carter Center down in Atlanta, where President Carter actually came and held a summit for ending sexual exploitation. And he brought together private companies. He brought together nonprofits and law enforcement, and they brought us together in the same way that we already sort of work together here in Minnesota, but on a national, actually a global basis. And so we started talking with each other. We started sharing best practices. And I will actually say that from that, the Best Employers Alliance was formed. BEST stands for Businesses Ending Slavery and Trafficking. And so we actually formed a business alliance that businesses can join. It was launched a couple of weeks ago in Seattle, and I was really proud to be there as representing Carlson as a founding member of the alliance. And we're out here, we're encouraging other businesses to join the alliance, because through the alliance, you learn about what you can do within your business, and you share best practices. So, you know, when Carlson started doing this, it was pretty tough because there wasn't a lot of support. There wasn't a lot of businesses doing this. But through the years, you know, this has ramped up quite a bit. And so now I hope my training isn't the best out there. I hope someone else has found something new that I can take and make mine better. You know, we want to be able to share our best practices and move this along together. So, so I think that that's my point, is that together, we can really make a difference in this, all of us. Thank you.
Terrific, and thank you very much, and thanks to all of our panelists. And I know that we have some questions that are coming, and so as I await the cards, and I think several of them are coming, and I think anyone who wants to still hand them in, please do. I think that one thing I'll start just to kick it off here is you know, Brenda, you know, based on your comments, and I'll throw this question out to a couple of you, you said that businesses have a lot of influence, and indeed they do. So do individuals, so do consumers, and most important, so do voters. And so for all of you, if you just could say a quick word, unlike some contentious social issues, of course in this week we've had gun control that's in the news. There are very clear advocacy groups that are on different sides of the issue. There are no advocacy groups for human trafficking. And yet it's taken a while, you know, for global governments and certainly the federal government and some state governments to have more robust response to this. Why is that, and why is this hard to get through some legislative processes? And you know, I'll start with you, Representative Pinto, because you're involved in that, but I'd love to just, you know, get some thoughts from each of you on this, please.
Well, so this issue is deeply counterintuitive and unfamiliar to people. But so I actually, in my experience now, having done, I mean, it's really, we're probably over a couple thousand people being trained in various groups. I just think it's only once you kind of get it, and you have to go through the process of getting it, and until you get it, it just doesn't work. And so we've actually had tremendous success in Minnesota because of work by the Advocates for Human Rights and others back moving people's minds to get it. Because it's the sort of thing like it's, I often say towards the end of a training, at this point, as we're laying out various practical things and stuff, probably at this point it's common sense to you, to whomever I'm training, because once you get it, you can figure it out. But until you do, it just doesn't work. And so I think we cannot underestimate how what a hurdle there is to just get people's minds in the right place on this. And that's what we all need to be doing.
And Brenda, any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Well.
Can you hear me? Yes. I think you hit it right on the head that we have to get people to a certain place with this. And for us as a business, that's particularly difficult because there are so many people coming through our doors, right? Some people might get it, but a lot of them might not. And so because we come from the business perspective, we have to take it slowly with our guests. We don't want to offend our guests or scare our guests or, do something that would make them not want to, stay at our hotels or use our travel services. So, it's because there's a learning curve here. And there's a lot of subtle nuances to this that some people get part of it and not other pieces of it. So, but I see the tide turning. I see the tide turning, that a lot of people are starting to understand this, and so it spreads. I'm a big, I like to visualize the stone in the pond and the ripple effect. And so each one of you here today, I see, a couple hundred faces, but I know that you all have families at homes. And I know that you go back to your schools and you'll talk about things. So hopefully that ripple effect will help us to get over some of these hurdles.
And Robin, please.
I'd like to add just, we so appreciate the Carlson companies, and I think the leadership, it can't really be overstated. And, Marilyn taking a stand when everybody, I read her book and was just really amazed by her courage in being attacked already for being one of the few women CEOs, saying that, bad things happening in our hotels don't help anybody, and recognizing that businesses, people don't want to patronize businesses when bad things are happening. Business is part of promoting human rights, and I think our organization, the Advocates for Human Rights, is really based on the idea that we all have a part to making human rights real, and that wherever we are, we can impact the people around us, and that if we don't work with businesses, if we don't work with elected representatives, students, doctors, teachers, everybody, that people can have a different day job and be a human rights advocate. And I participated in a conference where they were talking about how do we get human rights people to the table in the corporate boardrooms. And I said, why don't we think about this a little differently? How do we get the people in the corporate boardrooms to see themselves as human rights advocates? They're not mutually exclusive, and I think, like I said, I think Carlson Companies is a great example of that. And as you're looking at what you want to do to all the young people, be an ambassador for human rights no matter what you're doing, because you can really have a strong impact.
Thank you all very much. And Brenda, you had mentioned that a lot of the best and the brightest of young people in society many of them are heading towards, the public sector or trying to solve some of these problems. But based on these questions, some of them should go into journalism, because maybe after my job here, there's some really, really good ones here. I'm going to get to as many as possible. Some are specifically geared towards some of the panelists, and the first one is for Representative Pinto. You mentioned a reservation-specific navigator. Are Native girls or any other demographic particularly vulnerable or disproportionately victimized in the sex trafficking industry? What is the demographic trend of victims?
Yeah, so anyone with vulnerabilities is particularly susceptible to this. There are, we say as kids of color certainly are more susceptible, and just in terms of that kind of nature demographic, and then certainly Native youth are way disproportionately. So in Minneapolis, for example, recently 3/4 of the juvenile exploitation cases involve Native victims, and versus 2% of the city's population. So 75% versus 2%. So absolutely disproportionately involved. And I should have noted too, one of the things that we're working on is we're going to do a tribal summit in May of 2016, bringing together all the tribes and state government as a summit of governments to try to address this both in reservations but also in, of course, Native communities throughout the state. So yeah, no, it's a huge concern in that community.
Thank you very much. And this is a question that perhaps could, go to all three of you, but I'm going to direct it to you, Brenda Schultz, because in particular the work that your organization has done, you might have some specific learning here. As we know, the question asks, human trafficking is often a hidden operation. What signs can we look for to help victims?
Well, I can talk to you about what we look for in our hotels. So when we tell our front desk employees to watch for someone who, maybe someone younger who's with someone older and they seem to be controlled by that person. Maybe they are not allowed to speak freely. Often victims of sex trafficking are tattooed. It might say something like daddy's girl or something like that. So sometimes they're tattooed with a brand. If they try to check in with cash, paying cash instead of having to put down a credit card and show a driver's license, so we don't allow that. Maybe they stay in their room and they don't want housekeeping for 3 days. Maybe the housekeeper goes into the room and sees signs that don't look right. There might be pornography around. There might be many cell phones around. There might be lots of towels being used, etc. So these are the types of things that we look for. I think it's what we try to tell people is if your gut is telling you something that something might be wrong, your gut's usually right. So, but not to intervene. We ask our employees to speak to a manager and the manager to collect additional information and call the authorities. So.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to combine two questions here, and then whoever wants to address it, and if multiple panelists want to, that's certainly fine as well. The first one, and this is more of a regional question here, and I think quite compelling, why is Minnesota's numbers in human trafficking so high? What makes us so different? And then combined, the question is, there's much trafficking going on in North Dakota in relation to the oil boom, something that's been well chronicled in the Star Tribune and other places. Are North Dakota's laws comparable to Minnesota's laws?
Well, maybe I'll do so. I want to challenge the premise of the question because I don't think it's any worse here than any other place. Here's what we tell folks all throughout the state, small towns, et cetera. If you have runaways, or you have the internet, or you have both, you have this. And so there's a lot of talk about like, oh, wow, it has to do with the oil boom, and there's like the highways and, et cetera. I mean, sure, right? But there's highways in different parts of the country, et cetera. You might hear a statistic, we've got the 13th worst numbers in the country. That's actually a misquoting of that statistic. There were just 13 cities the FBI a while back said do have human trafficking, not to say other cities don't. I don't think we have this any worse than any place else in the country, but we certainly don't have it better either. So just to be clear, it's just we have human beings and therefore we have trafficking. So there's no distinction there. I'm not as familiar. I know North Dakota's laws are not nearly as favorable as ours, but I'm not sure if either panelist is more familiar with that. If Robin, you are.
I'm not. I don't.
Okay. Yeah, not experts on North Dakota laws up here, unfortunately. But I do know North Dakota is. I mean, certainly the oil boom has resulted in a lot of concern, and they've been doing a lot in their state and reaching out and connecting with us in their work.
I'm going to continue with you, Representative Pinto, but I just on a quick follow-on question that was asked up here, since we're talking about regional issues, but a very specific Minneapolis, Twin Cities issue on a very specific day in terms of what specifically, what steps will Minnesota take to protect against trafficking, especially as a host of the Super Bowl, recognized as one of the largest human trafficking events, and of course we have other major events coming up.
Yeah, although, again, this can be a little bit misleading. There's a lot of talk among advocates that this focus on big events, yes, there's an increase in big events, but if we focus too much on big events, then we tend to sort of think, well, it's not a problem other times, and then, wow, it's such a problem when the Super Bowl, the Final Four, whatever else comes to town. So I'm not as familiar with what they're doing operationally. I mean, certainly it goes up, but we want to be really careful about sort of perpetuating that myth or that concern that, wow, we really need to be so concerned about this at those times, because proportionally, I actually doubt that it's that big of a change. I mean, it certainly goes up, but I mean, again, it's like this already, right? So then you add this this on top, but still, it's not that much bigger. If you were to check your phone on Backpage when we started this, and then hit refresh every 10 minutes, or certainly, let's say, give yourself 20 minutes, the ads that were at the top on your phone, you wouldn't be able to see anymore in the course of the 20 minutes while we've been sitting here. So it's happening all the time, and that's just the stuff that's online. And of course, when you add in all the other forms of exploitation, so we want to be careful being kind of misled by this.
Thank you very much. And Robin Phillips, I know this may not necessarily be your organization's direct focus, but certainly the extensive work that the Advocates has done in this, you might be able to best address this. Do any therapy techniques exist to rehabilitate the victims of human trafficking? Do any organizations and support groups exist to assist former victims?
We don't do direct service. We work on laws and policies and education, but we do have great groups here, Breaking Free, Family Partnership. Because so many victims of trafficking experience PTSD, some forms of torture even, we know how to treat torture victims here. We have the Center for Victims of Torture. There are a large number of organizations that deal with all sorts of issues related to mental health. I think those things are really important, but also generally medical needs. I think there's as many needs as there are victims of trafficking, and so, but there are places that are dedicated just to the victims of trafficking, and so they have a range of services, and we are working with the coalition, trying to train up people, get them to recognize it, and see how their services fit with what trafficking victims need.
John, if I can just mention, so like one example of one, there's a group called Heartland Girls Ranch in western Minnesota, Benson, Minnesota, that uses equestrian therapy, and they're for sexually exploited youth. They receive their supportive services grant from the Minnesota Department of Health. So there's a lot that's out. There's a lot of possibilities out there, but of course, getting sufficient funding and support to meet the need is really hard.
And Brenda Schultz, of course, your organization has a global footprint, and I know you're specifically focused on the Americas, but your Redison is truly international. And so one of the questions is on both a domestic and international level, what is the relationship between a girl's education and her chances of being trafficked?
Well, I don't think I don't think I have that. I can't say definitively what that is. I would say I think that we see, and you stop me because I think you're more of an expert in this area, but I would think that we see a definite correlation between poverty and trafficked youth. And so I would guess that the educational piece would actually go along with that. Am I correct?
Yeah, and I would say that when we look at all the vulnerabilities, poverty is definitely one. And when, along with education, becomes increased opportunities. And so I think that we see that, but I think it's also important not to try to divide people into people who aren't potentially at risk, because I think regardless, we're seeing, again, we can look at where it's bigger numbers, but it's wealthy suburban families, it's poverty in inner cities, it's all sorts of things, and nobody's completely immune when there are other issues going on. Being a runaway isn't restricted to your socioeconomic status. And so we need to have our minds broad enough to want to protect all the victims, and then we need to look at the realities to make the best interventions and maybe prioritize the interventions.
Thank you. And Representative Pinto, you just mentioned the hypothetical of Backpage.com on people's smartphones, and of course everyone in here and within society globally are living through these technological transformations. And so the question is, if you could please explain more clearly the role of the internet and online platforms in worsening trafficking.
Well, so I'd say kind of on both the input side and the output side. So the recruitment of victims happens very much online. When I do training presentations, I show, there's a trafficker in a case I had who he just would be on Facebook and look for pictures of pretty girls and just friend them, 150 a day. And the girls most likely to respond to engage in conversation with him are those who are going to be in vulnerable situations, maybe going through a bad patch in their lives, whatever else. And they could be in any part of the country. He can be anywhere. And make that connection online. And so we have so much recruiting that happens online. And then, of course, the buying and the selling happens online as well, both in commercial, both in Backpage, kind of open, and also in closed networks. I think you're going to hear from Lauren Martin after this, and in making those connections as well. And so it's extremely powerful. Yeah.
And Robin Phillips, of course, a lot of the conversation here has been focused on sex trafficking, but a compelling question about what Minnesota has done, says the questioner, has done very little to investigate and prosecute cases of labor trafficking. Do you see policies in the near future to address labor trafficking in Minnesota?
Yes, I do. I think, we're working right now on, we did a needs assessment report essentially on integration of immigrants into our communities in a variety of areas, education, public safety, and one of them was the workplace, and we saw a number of things. We published that report a couple years ago. We're now looking just at workplace practices, and as I mentioned, the task force initially took up sex trafficking, but is very concerned about labor trafficking, and so I think part of it is trying to figure out what the vulnerabilities are. I think what we've found so far in the labor trafficking is that people are seemingly even less willing than in sex trafficking to come forward. That the work in the shadows, that bad practices, that the exploitation of labor for people who are desperate to keep their jobs is a serious problem here in Minnesota and in Minneapolis. And I think the more that we can learn about the vulnerabilities, the more we can focus policy discussions and targeted interventions on labor trafficking. But it's certainly not being ignored, and the task force is talking about it, and we're looking at different ways to research it.
And Brenda Schultz, to what degree does your organization see labor trafficking, and have you been able to take any steps to have, employees or guests watch out for that as well?
Yeah, it is something that we are concerned with. The hotel industry is quite aware of something called debt bondage, where a person may pay a recruiter to get them a job in another country, and then they get to that country and that recruiter has them, instead of the $25 an hour job they were promised so that they could quickly pay back the recruiter, they put them into a forced labor type of situation. And hotels often contract out for housekeeping. So you may not know that. So a lot of times you're not a hotel employee when you're a housekeeper in some situations. And so if a hotel contracts with one of these traffickers unknowingly, then you could have your housekeepers in a nice hotel who are actually being labor trafficked. So the hospitality industry is taking this very seriously, and we're just trying to make sure that we're working with reputable companies, and we help our hotels understand, like, what questions might you ask. So if you suspect something might be wrong with one of your housekeepers, there's certain questions you can ask. Are you in control? And you wouldn't do this like in front of other people. So you would discreetly ask, are you safe? Do you have safe housing? Are you in control of your legal documents? Questions like that, because they may not even see themselves as victims of trafficking. So, so we're out there looking for it and doing what we can to raise awareness around the entire hospitality industry.
Well, speaking of that, I'm going to stick with you for just a moment, because as we come close to wrapping up here, you're not only international but involved, and there are some very practical questions about how to address some of these questions. So I'm going to wrap up with those. So if we look at your organization, one of the questions is specifically, how can hotel groups access these training materials? How do you take this beyond your organization?
Yeah, well, so we have training materials that we require all of our employees to go through, but we've also taken those training materials and offered them as an example to other major hotel companies. So over the past few years, I've talked to pretty much every major hotel company that comes to your mind, and actually sent them samples of everything we had so that they can create their own training. Within the hospitality industry, we have the ECPAC Code of Conduct for the protection of children from sexual exploitation in travel and tourism. And we have signed that code, and we encourage others to sign the code. And once you have signed the code, you're required to train your employees. And so a lot of these companies that have signed will then go on to create their own training. Also, those companies that haven't signed are still aware of the issue, and they're creating their own training on their own without signing the code. And as well as the code itself has created training, and ECPAT USA worked with the American Hotel and Lodging Association to create an online training so that even if you run a little mom and pop shop, you don't have the expertise around this. So how can you create training for your employees about something you're not really even sure about? And then the training itself can be very expensive to create and push out. So ECPAT USA worked with American Hotel and Lodging Association's Educational Institute, created an online training, put it out there for anybody to use at $20, and they quickly realized, let's make this free to everybody.
And just a reminder, so that those hotel posters I mentioned are available from Ramsey County Attorney's Office and the accompanying DVDs. And I should have noted, actually, that Carlson, this will not surprise you to know, was integrally involved in putting them together, and I think helped provide funding and supporting that. So that's been a huge part of their work as well. So a reminder about that.
So, and great county attorneys who care about this and bring it out to their hotels. So it is a cycle that really does snowball once people understand the issue.
And speaking of specifically focused efforts, question is, how can I, a student and member of the Somali community, help raise awareness in my community and my neighborhood? Can my efforts be impactful?
Is that aimed at
Representative Pinto, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, no, of course it can. I mean, I have to say, you have power, right? So yes, you absolutely can have an impact. How you can best raise awareness, I actually think you, the questioner, is in a much better position to think about that in your community than in any of our communities than I am individually. I guess I would just say the two things we want to be really getting out there, right, is this sense that this is different than we might think. This is counterintuitive. Victims, I say to cops, victims can have a phone sitting right beside them by themselves for months on end. There's nothing physically stopping them from asking for help and for reaching out, but there's everything stopping them in all kinds of other ways. And so we need to recognize that. And then the other thing is just to reconceptualize on the buying side. This is not a rite of passage for men, or boys will be boys, or something kind of understandable. This is commercial sexual violence. It's commercial rape. And the buyers, the Johns, one view of them makes a lot of sense, they're commercial rapists. And so to reconceptualize this, to say this is not something to be sort of embarrassed about if you were caught doing it, it's something to be like deeply ashamed because you have committed a sexual assault on somebody. And that requires all of us to get that word out to our communities.
May I add?
Please.
I think you're an advocate when you leave this room and you go and you talk about this. You know, when I first started talking about child sexual exploitation at work, I would talk to a lot of people who were uncomfortable with that, with that topic. And so part of me wanted to pull back and use words to work around that and not really be very blunt about it. And, everyone has these delicate sensitivities. And then I realized by watching actually Marilyn Carlson Nelson speak to this, and here you have a woman in her 70s who without flinching will talk to you about, children being sexually exploited around the world, and it doesn't matter who she's talking to. And I thought, you know what, it's because she speaks so confidently about it that the person she's speaking to isn't then allowed to feel uncomfortable, right? I'm giving you permission if I'm the one weaving in and out. So when you talk about this topic, to understand the topic and don't be ashamed about talking about it. It's when we keep something in the dark. Mm-hmm. When the monster's only under the bed until you turn the light on. When you turn that light on and you look under the bed, that monster's gone. So let's all turn the light on and start talking about this.
Terrific, thank you. And as we... So finally and importantly, you have a room full of people here who want to turn that light on. And so the final two questions I'll just combine. How can I, as a high school student, what can I do in order to help this problem? And from an educator, how and what ways can college students gain educational and professional experiences involved with your either respective or other organizations and programs. And Robin, if you want to.
My turn, okay.
Your chance.
Well, asking the question is the first thing, but I would echo, get involved, speak out. You all have different groups and ways that you connect with each other. If you're looking for speakers, have people talk about this topic. As Brenda said, don't shy away from that. But then also look at your own, I think if every person viewed their own human rights as having also responsibilities, and bullying, you know, how do kids get marginalized? How do girls get in these positions where they're vulnerable, when they're not accepted? What is our own part in that? And how can we treat people with respect? How can we honor each other in how we go through our day-to-day lives? And when we talk about bullying, when we talk about these really, really serious issues, look at the impact they have on the people who are targeted for that. And then we have a page on our website, theadvocatesforhumanrights.org, on volunteering. We have formal internships. We do a quarterly orientation for people to learn about how you can volunteer. So if you're interested in the advocates and doing this kind of thing, please check that out. So.
Thank you very much. And it was mentioned on the panel before that Minnesota is a model, both nationally and internationally, for cooperation. I think it's highly representative here. So let's please give a big round of applause to our panelists, to the work they're doing. And while you're clapping, clap for yourself. Some great questions. So thank you very much, and thanks very much to Carol. I appreciate it.